My older neighbor teased me one night, and everything changed. The first time I really noticed her, I wasn't sure I should. She was just my neighbor, after all, a woman I'd seen across the hallway a dozen times, always poised, always confident in the quiet way only someone who's lived through a lot could be. She moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless, as though the world itself bent slightly around her presence. That evening, I caught her in the warm golden glow of the late afternoon sun, standing in her doorway, sipping a cup of tea. The sunlight brushed against her hair, turning soft chestnut strands into streaks of light. Even from a distance, I felt the subtle pull of curiosity that I wasn't used to feeling. I remember the sound first. Not her voice, she hadn't spoken yet, but the faint rustle of her dress as she adjusted her stance, the gentle clink of porcelain as she set her cup on the small table beside her door. It was mundane, almost trivial, yet it resonated with me in a way I couldn't quite place. I had passed her countless times in the hallway, but something about the way she lingered there, unhurried, aware, almost teasing the day itself, made me pause. My chest tightened, not in alarm, but in anticipation. It was the quiet kind of awareness that prickled the skin, like when a soft breeze brushes against your neck and you suddenly notice everything around you. I fumbled with the keys in my hand, pretending to unlock my door while stealing glances at her. She caught me, of course, but didn't look away. Instead, there was this tiny, almost imperceptible smile that tugged at the corner of her lips. It wasn't flirty, not exactly, not yet, but it carried warmth, recognition, and a hint of playfulness that made my stomach flutter. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. She was older, experienced, composed. I was just a young man, 22, still figuring out what it meant to feel seen. And yet, there was something in the way she held her gaze that suggested she saw more than I intended to show. The first brush of contact was accidental, yet unforgettable. I carried a bag of groceries that evening, and she happened to step aside as I navigated the narrow hallway. Our shoulders brushed lightly. That single touch, a brief, fleeting moment, sent an unfamiliar warmth shooting through me. It wasn't romantic in an overt sense, but it was intimate, human, grounding. The air seemed to thicken, and for a moment, all I could hear was the thump of my own heartbeat. She gave me a nod, almost apologetic, almost knowing. I smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond, yet unwilling to look away. I started noticing the small details. The faint perfume that trailed behind her, something floral, soft, lingering like a memory. The way her hands rested casually on the banister, fingers long and delicate, moving with an ease that made even simple gestures seem elegant. The subtle creases around her eyes when she smiled, telling me she had laughed at more than her fair share of life's absurdities. Each detail added layers to the curiosity stirring within me. I didn't want to intrude, I simply wanted to observe, to understand why the ordinary act of seeing her made the hallway feel charged, alive. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the encounter, I realized how unusual it was for me to feel this drawn to someone without any overt reason. I wasn't usually observant of small movements, small habits, yet here I was, analyzing the way she had tilted her head as she sipped her tea, the subtle lift of her brow as she caught my glance. I imagined the next encounter. What would she say, what would she do, and how would I respond? The idea of it made my pulse quicken. It was curiosity, yes, but it was also anticipation, the slow awakening of interest that felt dangerously sweet. By the time the weekend arrived, I found myself lingering near my doorway, pretending to adjust a shoelace, pretending to check my phone, just to catch a glimpse of her. And there she was again, smiling at me from across the hall, a quiet acknowledgement that made the air between us feel warmer than it had any right to. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Enough to start a story neither of us knew was beginning. The kind of story that would unfold in small gestures, whispered moments, and a tension that simmered gently beneath the surface. In that first moment, curiosity was all I allowed myself to feel. But deep down, I knew it was the start of something far more intricate, a connection that would slowly, quietly, grow between us. And I could feel it already, the quiet thrill of being noticed by someone who knew exactly how to hold your attention without even trying. It started with a small comment, almost casual, but the way she said it sent a jolt through me. I was carrying a box of groceries up the narrow stairwell when she appeared at her door, one hand resting lightly on the frame. She tilted her head, that familiar spark in her eyes, and said, "I heard you were strong, show me tonight?" Her tone was teasing, playful, with just enough challenge to make it impossible to ignore. My first instinct was to flush bright red. I dropped my eyes, fumbling with the box as though it were suddenly far too heavy, and yet I couldn't help glancing back at her, drawn by the warmth of her gaze. There was an almost imperceptible pause between her words and my reaction, a silence thick with electricity. The hallway suddenly felt smaller, closer. The distant hum of the city outside faded into nothing, leaving only the soft scrape of my shoes against the worn steps and the gentle flutter of my heartbeat in my ears. I realized, in that instant, that she wasn't just teasing me, she was drawing me out, testing the edges of something unspoken between us. And, inexplicably, I wanted to rise to it. I tried to laugh it off, a nervous chuckle that barely disguised the jolt of excitement coursing through me. You'll see," I muttered, my voice lower than intended. Her smile widened, not mocking, but warm, knowing. She leaned slightly on the doorframe, the sunlight catching her hair in golden streaks, and for a moment, the world felt suspended. I noticed things I hadn't before, the delicate curve of her neck, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the frame as she waited, the subtle sway of her weight from one leg to the other. Every detail felt deliberate, yet effortless, like a quiet invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. My mind spun with possibilities. Was she joking? Testing me? Or, was there something else in the way she looked at me that made my pulse quicken? I had never felt such a curious mix of pride and embarrassment. The thought that she saw me, truly noticed me in some way beyond the casual greetings in the hallway, was intoxicating. I felt younger and inexperienced, yet somehow capable. Her teasing was a subtle challenge, one that tugged at something deeper inside me, a desire to rise, to prove myself, to be seen as more than I often allowed myself to be. She stepped closer, and the air between us grew warmer, charged. There was no physical touch yet, but the proximity alone was a caress, an unspoken brush of intimacy. I could feel the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the crisp air of the stairwell, floral with a hint of something earthy, grounding. I swallowed hard, aware of the way her gaze followed my movements as I struggled with the groceries, my fingers brushing the edges of the box almost nervously. Every movement felt heightened, deliberate, electric. And then, the smallest touch, a light tap of her hand against my arm as she laughed at my fumbling attempt to maneuver the box, sent a shiver through me. It wasn't flirty in the crude sense, it was precise, intimate, teasing. My body reacted before my mind could catch up, a flush of warmth across my chest, a tightening of my stomach, a sharp awareness of the space between us. I realized, almost reluctantly, that I was enjoying this, enjoying the challenge, the spark, the playful tension that hung in the air. Her teasing didn't stop at words. She lingered just long enough to let the silence speak, letting her eyes hold mine in a quiet conversation of their own. There was humor in her expression, yes, but also curiosity, and maybe something else I wasn't ready to name. Every glance, every subtle tilt of her head, was an unspoken dare. And yet, there was a softness too, a warmth that softened the edge of the challenge, making it feel safe, human, alive. I felt the odd mix of vulnerability and excitement, the thrill of being caught off guard by someone who saw me fully and dared me to respond. By the time I reached my door, my hands still tingling from the faint brush of her touch, I knew something had shifted. The curiosity that had first pulled me toward her had grown into a quiet, insistent tension, a pull that made me replay every detail in my mind. The way she had leaned against the frame, the laughter that danced in her voice, the subtle acknowledgement of my presence, it was all a challenge wrapped in warmth. A slow-burn spark, a teasing tension that promised more if I was willing to rise to it. And for the first time, I caught myself wondering not just about what she wanted from me, but about what I wanted from her, what I might discover if I dared to respond, to lean into the tension, to meet her teasing with something of my own. The hallway, once mundane, had become a stage, and the evening, a test of hearts neither of us knew we were playing. It started innocently enough, a casual knock on her door, a request for borrowing something trivial, maybe sugar or a spare tool, but the moment I stepped inside her apartment, I realized how different it felt from any previous encounter. The space was warm and lived in, sunlight spilling through sheer curtains onto the hardwood floor. The faint aroma of coffee mingled with the subtle scent of her perfume, floral but grounded, a soft note that lingered in the corners of the room. She smiled as I entered, and something in her gaze shifted. It wasn't teasing now, but something quieter, more attentive, almost inviting. We settled into her small living area, her graceful movements deliberate yet effortless, her fingers brushing over the edge of a cup as she poured me coffee. I noticed the faint tremor in her hands, almost imperceptible, a humanizing flaw beneath the exterior of confidence I had admired from afar. It was in that detail, in the small imperfection, that I felt the first real stirrings of emotional connection. Up until now, our encounters had been playful, teasing, charged with subtle tension, but now there was depth. Something unspoken, waiting to be acknowledged. She began talking, softly at first, about mundane things, the noise from the street, the challenges of running errands, but her voice held a cadence that suggested experience, reflection. I listened, more fascinated by the rhythm of her speech than the content itself. And then, without warning, the conversation shifted. She mentioned a recent disappointment, a project that hadn't gone as planned, a moment of vulnerability that she hadn't shared with anyone else. Her eyes flicked to mine, almost searching, and I realized she trusted me to see her beyond the confident exterior. My chest tightened. There was a gravity here, a quiet intimacy I hadn't anticipated. I responded cautiously, careful not to overstep, sharing a small fragment of my own struggle, something I rarely voiced, a personal failure or lingering insecurity. The effect was immediate. She leaned in slightly, tilting her head in curiosity and understanding, and for a moment our space felt suspended. Our hands brushed over the coffee cup, a fleeting connection, yet loaded with meaning. It was nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just a gentle reminder of shared humanity. I felt simultaneously exposed and seen, a rare combination that left me both nervous and exhilarated. The conversation deepened, moving naturally from light topics to memories and reflections, our voices dropping to tones that felt intimate and protective. I noticed her gestures, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the subtle shift of her posture when she shared something sensitive, the warmth in her eyes that lingered after a sentence. Every motion seemed intentional and unintentional at once, a dance of vulnerability and grace. I felt the walls around my own emotions soften in response, an unfamiliar but welcome sensation. She laughed at something I said, a gentle, melodic sound that resonated in the small room. But unlike her teasing laugh in the hallway, this one carried warmth and acceptance, the kind that invites trust. I noticed how she watched me as I spoke, her gaze steady and unflinching, as though she could read beneath my words to the emotions I often kept buried. In that moment, I realized the teasing had been an invitation, not just to prove my strength in some superficial sense, but to show her the parts of me I normally kept hidden. Time seemed to slow. The hum of the street outside faded into the background, replaced by the quiet rhythm of our voices, the occasional scrape of a chair, the gentle clink of our cups. There was no rush, no expectation, only the presence of two people choosing to be fully present with each other. I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a sense of connection I hadn't anticipated so early in our acquaintance. It was intimate without being romantic, close without being overwhelming, and yet charged with a subtle electricity that made the air between us feel alive. Before I left, she reached over to adjust a strand of my hair that had fallen across my forehead. The gesture was casual, yet the contact lingered just long enough to send a shiver through me. I noticed her eyes holding mine, a soft acknowledgement that we had shared something rare, a small but significant moment of trust. The hallway outside her door felt different when I stepped back into it, charged with unspoken understanding. The teasing from before had evolved into something more meaningful. We had begun to see each other, not just as a neighbor and a young man, but as individuals capable of connection, vulnerability, and unspoken affection. That night, I replayed the encounter endlessly. Her voice, her laughter, the warmth of her presence, they stayed with me, a quiet echo that wouldn't fade. I realized that curiosity had grown into something more subtle yet far more profound, an emotional tether that had been quietly pulled taut. And I knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The teasing would return, of course, but now it carried with it a new weight, a promise that our connection could grow, slowly, naturally, into something neither of us had expected but both of us might want. The weekend arrived with a soft, golden haze that seemed to stretch every moment into something heavier, warmer, more charged. I had been replaying our last conversation repeatedly in my mind, analyzing her gestures, her laughter, the gentle way she had leaned in when we shared small vulnerabilities. The memory of her hands brushing mine over the coffee cup lingered like an electric hum, making me aware of every inch of my body, every subtle quickening of my pulse. I wasn't sure if she realized the effect she had on me, but then again, maybe she did. Perhaps that was the thrill of it all, the teasing spark of awareness, the quiet play of tension that made even ordinary moments feel alive. She appeared at my door that Saturday afternoon, casually holding a small basket of pastries she claimed to have baked for the neighborhood, though it was clear she had prepared them with me in mind. The moment I opened the door, sunlight spilled across her face, catching the highlights in her hair and the faint shimmer of warmth in her skin. She smiled, that same confident, effortless smile that had first drawn me in, and held my gaze for just a beat longer than necessary. My stomach tightened. I felt the familiar mix of nervousness and exhilaration that always accompanied her presence. "Careful," she said lightly, stepping closer as I tried to maneuver the basket onto the counter. "Those look heavier than they are, but let's see if you're as strong as everyone says." The teasing lilt in her voice carried an undertone of challenge. My pulse jumped, and I realized I wanted, almost desperately, to rise to it. She wasn't just complimenting me or making idle conversation, she was inviting me into a game, subtle but intimate, one I wasn't entirely sure I knew how to play. As I lifted the basket, our hands brushed again, briefly, almost accidentally, but the warmth of her skin lingered in my mind long after contact ended. The hallway outside was quiet, the city sounds muted by the thick walls, but in the small space of my apartment everything seemed amplified, the soft hum of our voices, the faint clink of porcelain as she set down a mug, the way sunlight pooled across the hardwood floor like liquid gold. I could feel the tension coiling in my chest, a mix of anticipation and awareness, a delicious, slow-burning pull I could neither ignore nor resist. We moved around the apartment together, her presence filling every corner, her movements graceful but deliberate, a gentle choreography I couldn't take my eyes off. She leaned slightly closer as she handed me a napkin, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, floral but grounded, brushing against my awareness like a soft whisper. Every gesture, every glance, felt layered with meaning. I noticed the curve of her neck as she tilted her head, the faint crease between her brows when she focused, the warmth that radiated from her even in casual, mundane moments. It wasn't sexual, it was far more tantalizing, an intimacy of proximity, of awareness, of shared space that made ordinary interactions feel extraordinary. At one point, she laughed at a joke I made, that melodic, warm laugh that had become my personal soundtrack over the last few days. She leaned slightly toward me as she did, her gaze holding mine longer than necessary, a spark of challenge mingling with subtle curiosity. I caught my own breath in that moment, aware of the silent dialogue playing out between us. No words were needed to convey interest, to communicate that something unspoken was passing back and forth, a slow, deliberate flirtation that teased the heart without rushing it. When she finally took her leave, I felt a strange mix of disappointment and anticipation. Her departure left the apartment quieter, yet her presence lingered, like sunlight fading but leaving warmth behind. I realized that I was waiting, almost impatiently, for the next encounter, the next playful challenge, the next small brush of hands, the next moment that would make me acutely aware of her nearness and my own response. That night, I replayed every interaction in my mind, the brush of her fingers, the subtle tilt of her head, the warmth in her eyes. The teasing had evolved, it was no longer simply a challenge about strength. It had become a dialogue of presence, an unspoken acknowledgement of connection, a flirtation that was both playful and profound. My thoughts returned repeatedly to the sensation of being seen, the thrill of anticipation, the quiet, human intimacy that made every glance, every pause, feel heavy with potential. By the end of the evening, I understood something crucial. The slow-burn attraction between us was no longer just curiosity, it was emotional, sensory, and tangible. Every movement, every gesture, every playful tease was a carefully placed thread, weaving us together in a tapestry of tension and longing that neither of us could ignore. And for the first time, I realized that what I wanted wasn't just to respond to her teasing, but to meet her there, to engage in this subtle dance, to explore the possibilities that lay just beneath the surface, waiting for the courage to take shape. The evening arrived with a quiet anticipation that seemed to seep into every corner of the hallway. I had been replaying her words in my mind all day, her playful tease about my strength, the mischievous glint in her eyes, and now, standing outside her door, I felt the tension that had been slowly building between us over days of glances, laughter, and subtle touches. There was a stillness in the air, a charged expectation, and I realized I wanted more than casual encounters. I wanted to understand her, to see her fully, to meet her challenge with a part of myself I rarely shared. She opened the door before I had a chance to knock, her expression a mixture of curiosity and amusement. The soft light spilling from her apartment framed her in golden warmth, accentuating the quiet elegance in her posture. There was no rush in her movements, everything she did felt deliberate, measured, yet effortless. My chest tightened the moment I stepped inside, aware of the space between us, aware of the lingering electricity that had been slowly weaving itself into our encounters. "I thought you said you were strong," she said, her voice light, teasing, but there was an undercurrent I hadn't noticed before, something almost like challenge, or perhaps invitation. She gestured toward a small, awkwardly heavy piece of furniture that had been sitting in the corner of her living room for days, a couch cushion that needed moving, a box that needed lifting. My stomach fluttered. This wasn't just about strength, this was about presence, about trust, about sharing space in a way that felt intimate and alive. As I bent down to lift, our hands brushed against one another. The contact was brief but electric, a spark that traveled up my arm and made my heart beat faster than I expected. She didn't pull away, instead, she allowed the moment to linger, her eyes holding mine with a calm yet intense curiosity. There was something almost daring in the way she looked at me, a silent communication that said she noticed more than I realized, and that she wanted me to notice her in return. Moving the item together, our coordination felt almost like a dance. Our bodies occasionally pressed close, hips brushing accidentally, hands lingering over shared surfaces. Every contact was minimal but loaded with tension, a conversation spoken through proximity rather than words. The air was thick with the warmth of our shared effort, with the subtle brush of her clothing against mine, with the unspoken awareness that neither of us wanted this moment to end. At one point, she paused to adjust her footing, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, a floral, soft, intimate, wafting into my awareness. I swallowed hard, feeling the pull of desire tempered by nervousness. I was aware of every detail, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the tilt of her head as she watched me, the subtle, reassuring smile that softened the teasing edge of our interaction. I realized, in that suspended moment, that I was not just responding to a challenge of strength, I was responding to her presence, to the connection that had been quietly forming over weeks of small gestures and playful teasing. When we finally finished moving the furniture, we stood for a moment in quiet, catching our breath. The room was warm, golden in the soft evening light, and the silence between us was filled with a different kind of electricity. I noticed her hand lingering near mine as if unsure whether to retreat or reach, and in that hesitation, the tension became almost unbearable. Our eyes met, and the playful spark that had defined our earlier encounters softened into something deeper, more intimate, a recognition of the emotions that had been quietly simmering beneath the surface. She laughed softly, a sound that carried warmth, teasing, and something else I couldn't yet name. "Not bad," she murmured, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe you really are stronger than I thought." The words were simple, but the look she gave me carried layers of meaning. It wasn't about the physical challenge, it was about acknowledgement, about seeing and being seen, about the intimacy that forms when two people allow themselves to exist fully in the same space, sharing effort, laughter, and awareness. That night, as I left her apartment and stepped back into the hallway, my hands still tingling from the brief touches, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. The playful teasing had deepened into quiet connection. The flirtation had evolved into intimacy of presence. I felt a warmth, a tether that had been quietly forged through proximity, shared effort, and lingering glances. The emotional peak of our interactions had arrived, not in dramatic confession, but in the subtle, electric acknowledgement of connection, in the quiet thrill of being seen and meeting her challenge not just physically, but emotionally. And in that lingering warmth, I understood something profound. This was only the beginning. The teasing, the touches, the subtle flirtation, they were all threads weaving a tapestry of slow-burning tension, of curiosity and connection, of emotion that neither of us could ignore. And I knew, without doubt, that the next moments, the next conversations, would demand courage, honesty, and the willingness to face what we both felt but had yet to name. The evening was quiet, soft shadows stretching across the walls as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air smelled faintly of rain that had passed earlier in the day, mixed with the warm, comforting scent of her home. I had been invited to sit for a casual cup of tea, though by now, I knew these invitations carried a weight far beyond polite neighborly conversation. Every glance, every gesture between us had grown more charged, more deliberate, more intimate, and tonight felt different. There was a stillness in the room, a quiet anticipation that pressed gently against my chest, reminding me that some things were no longer just playful, they were real. We settled on the sofa, our knees brushing occasionally, small sparks of awareness shooting through me each time our bodies touched. The casual comfort of sitting side by side was tempered by the electricity in the air, a subtle tension that made each shared glance feel like a confession waiting to happen. She poured tea with her usual effortless grace, the steam curling up in delicate spirals, and handed me a cup. Her fingers brushed mine, a fleeting contact, but enough to send warmth through me that had nothing to do with the tea. I realized that I was acutely aware of everything she did, the tilt of her head, the curve of her lips as she smiled softly, the way her gaze lingered on me a fraction longer than necessary. "Do you ever think about things that might be complicated?" she asked suddenly, her voice low, almost hesitant. Her words hung in the air, careful, deliberate. I could feel her vulnerability behind them, a quiet invitation to speak honestly. I hesitated, feeling the weight of my own thoughts pressing in, the nervousness, the age gap between us, the uncertainty of how to express what I felt without overstepping some invisible boundary. And yet, her question was an opening I could not ignore. "I do," I admitted quietly, meeting her eyes. "More than I probably should." My words felt small, inadequate, but she didn't laugh or dismiss them. Instead, she leaned slightly closer, her presence grounding me, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit more. "Sometimes I feel drawn to people in ways I don't fully understand. And sometimes, it's terrifying because I don't know what it might mean." The confession felt raw, unpolished, but the moment it left my lips, a strange lightness settled over the tension in my chest. She listened, her eyes never leaving mine, her hand resting near mine, almost touching but careful not to overstep. "I understand," she murmured, a softness threading through her tone. "It can be complicated." There was an honesty there, a recognition that mirrored my own fears. Her words were gentle, but the pause that followed them was loaded with unspoken emotion, a space where all the things we hadn't dared to say hovered between us. We sat in silence for a while, letting the quiet fill the room, letting the shared understanding settle. Every subtle movement, her hand shifting slightly, my fingers brushing the edge of my cup, felt amplified, as though the air itself had become aware of our hesitations, our desires, and the vulnerability we were daring to share. There was an intimacy in that silence, a connection deeper than words, that made the room feel simultaneously safe and electrifying. "I don't know where this could go," she said finally, voice soft but steady, eyes searching mine. "I like the way we connect. But I'm aware of the differences, the complications. And I don't want to rush anything." Her honesty was a mirror to my own internal conflict, the desire to reach out, to close the distance, tempered by fear and uncertainty. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and tension. Relief that she understood, tension that the answer wasn't simple. "I feel it too," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about it, or about you. And it terrifies me, and excites me. All at once." The words lingered, raw and unguarded. She reached out then, her hand brushing mine lightly, a fleeting but significant touch that made my heart race. It was tentative, careful, and full of meaning. Her eyes softened, and a small, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips, a smile that said more than words could convey. In that moment, I realized that confession didn't need a resolution yet. The acknowledgement of our feelings, the quiet honesty, the subtle touch, and the shared vulnerability were enough to deepen our connection. It was a slow, deliberate intimacy, a dance of hesitation and desire, recognition and restraint. And though the future remained uncertain, the bond we shared had grown undeniable. As the evening wore on, the tension remained soft, simmering, and alive, but it was no longer just teasing or playful. It had become something real, fragile, and beautiful, the beginning of understanding, the start of trust, and the delicate awakening of feelings that neither of us could ignore. Tonight, we had crossed a threshold. Not toward a dramatic confession or bold action, but toward honesty, toward connection, and toward the quiet acknowledgement that what existed between us was far more than either had expected. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's balcony and the soft hum of the city settling into quiet. I found myself standing outside her door once again, the weight of everything unspoken between us pressing gently against my chest. Unlike the playful teasing or the tension of our earlier conversations, tonight felt decisive, not in a rushed, dramatic way, but in a quiet, intimate sense of inevitability. There was a pause before I knocked, a moment to collect the courage to step into the space where emotions had already begun to ripple and settle, subtly but profoundly. She opened the door with her familiar, effortless grace, and the soft glow of her apartment framed her in golden light. Her eyes held mine immediately, not teasing, not challenging, but open and aware, reflecting the same hesitations and desires I had been carrying. For a brief moment, we simply looked at each other, letting the quiet speak. Every heartbeat, every breath felt magnified, the distance between us heavy with meaning, yet charged with anticipation. "Hi," she said softly, her voice carrying warmth and a hint of vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. That single word was both greeting and acknowledgement, a bridge over the weeks of subtle teasing, playful flirtation, and emotional discovery. I stepped inside, and the familiar sense of her home wrapped around me, the faint floral hint of her perfume, the lingering warmth of baked goods from earlier days, the soft, comforting undertone of the room itself. Each detail grounded me, reminding me that intimacy wasn't only in words or gestures, it was in presence, attention, and the willingness to share space with someone fully. We moved to the sofa, sitting closer than usual. Our knees brushed occasionally, small sparks of awareness igniting each time, but there was no rush, no urgency. Instead, the atmosphere was deliberate, slow, and intentional. Tonight was about acknowledgement, honesty, and the quiet surrender to emotions long simmering beneath the surface. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady yet tender, "about everything. About us. About what this connection really means." She paused, giving me time to absorb her words. Her hand hovered near mine, not quite touching, but the proximity alone was electric, enough to make my pulse quicken. I reached out, gently letting my fingers brush against hers. The contact was simple, unassuming, but it carried the weight of weeks of anticipation, of playfulness, of shared vulnerability. "I feel the same," I admitted quietly. "Every time we talk, every glance, every touch, it's more than I expected. And I don't want to ignore it anymore." The words felt raw, sincere, carrying the nervous weight of confession but also the thrill of possibility. Her eyes softened, and she smiled, a small, quiet smile that conveyed warmth, acceptance, and an unspoken understanding. In that moment, the teasing intention of the past weeks crystallized into something tangible: mutual recognition, emotional intimacy, and a shared willingness to embrace what we felt. She leaned slightly closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed the warmth in her presence, the subtle, grounding sense that everything we had shared had led to this quiet moment. Our hands intertwined naturally, fingers locking with ease, and the simple act felt monumental, a tactile acknowledgement of connection that neither words nor gestures alone could convey. The weight of the age gap, the social complications, and our earlier hesitations seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the clarity of mutual care and desire. We talked then, slowly, honestly, about the things that mattered: the uncertainties, the hopes, the delicate balance of excitement and hesitation. Every glance, every laugh, every soft brush of the hand reinforced the bond that had grown between us, a bond born of curiosity, trust, and the slow-burning intimacy of shared space and shared attention. By the time the conversation ebbed, there was a sense of completeness, a quiet resolution that felt deeply satisfying. When we finally leaned back, our shoulders touching lightly, I felt the culmination of weeks of tension, teasing, and vulnerability settle into warmth. She rested her head briefly on my shoulder, a gesture that spoke volumes without words, and I felt the same ease and comfort that comes when emotional walls fall away. The connection was undeniable, real, human, tender, and deeply satisfying. As I left her apartment that night, the city around me felt different. The evening was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and I carried with me a profound sense of fulfillment. Whatever challenges or uncertainties might come, the bond we had forged, through teasing, laughter, vulnerability, and subtle intimacy, was real, resilient, and transformative. The slow burn had reached its resolution, not in fireworks or dramatic declarations, but in quiet acknowledgement, a hand held, a gaze shared, a heart recognized. And in that simplicity, I understood that our story, playful, intimate, cautious, and deeply human, had found its home.